Hello. Welcome to this short video about giving and receiving feedback. This video should be useful for anyone who works in higher education, but it comes to you from the MSc in Medical Education at the Swansea University Medical School. There's a lot that's been written about feedback. What makes good feedback, bad feedback, how to give specific feedback to certain groups of learners on certain tasks in certain formats. We're going to try and synthesize all of that into this short video and just give you some basic evidence-based practical tips. If we had to summarize them into one simple principle, it would be that feedback can be best approached by giving useful advice for the next time the person is doing the task that you're giving them feedback on. If you keep that in mind, you're going to be on a good track to giving people useful, meaningful, constructive feedback. It's not going to be suitable for every circumstance, for every learner, but it's a good start. Let me explain a bit more about how to make that happen. We can break feedback down or classify feedback according to the depth of the feedback statement that's given to people. For example, we might give people feedback that's simply descriptive. This is good, this is bad, this is poor, this needs improvement. It's far better to give people that feedback that is qualified. If we tell them something is good or bad, then we need to tell them why. This is good because it meets the learning outcomes. Better still is to give feedback that is constructive. This is good because it meets the learning outcomes, but it would be better if it did these additional things. If we can strive towards this third type of constructive feedback, then we're going a long way to giving people useful advice for the next time that they do something. We can break this down further still. Feedback can often be thought of as positive or negative, critical or positive, good or bad. The same classification that we just talked about in the previous slide can be applied to both critical and positive feedback as well. We can give our learners feedback that something is poor or needs improvement. That can be descriptive, but it's better if we qualify it. Why is something poor? Why does it need improvement? And better still, what could the learner do to improve? The same applies to positive feedback. Even if something is really good, it helps to give people advice for how it could be better still. There's also neutral feedback, statements that are neither critical nor positive but are descriptive in a way that many people giving feedback find useful. For example, many people giving feedback find it useful to start their feedback session with a summary of what it is that they're giving feedback on. That's a way of communicating to the learner that they have understood what it is that they're giving feedback on. They've understood the student's essay or presentation or the clinical examination they've just been given. Whenever we're giving feedback, we want to try and strive towards feedback that's qualified and better still constructive. We want to avoid the purely descriptive feedback. Critical or negative descriptive feedback is only damaging. Even positive feedback, if it's only descriptive, is not all that useful. It's nice to be told that something is good, but it's far better to be told why it's good, because then you know what to do for the next time. Then you know what to keep doing when you repeat that task. And that's what feedback is partially all about. If we're going to strive for only one type of feedback, then we might strive for the positive, constructive feedback, pointing out what's good in what it is that our learners have done, but giving them advice on where it could be better still. Let me talk you through some examples of this. Here are some sample feedback. I know that it's real feedback because it was written on a student presentation a few years ago. The student is given the following feedback. A well-chosen topic presented with concise and accurate slides. However, the presentation was let down by a weak visual design, poor timekeeping, and a flat delivery. And as I said, this is real feedback. Let's reconsider this feedback then in terms of the different classifications that I talked about in the previous slides. Let's start with this first sentence, a well-chosen topic. This is positive, but only descriptive feedback. If you're the person getting this feedback, you need to know why the topic is well chosen. What is it that's useful about this topic that you can bear in mind the next time you do a similar sort of activity? The next couple of statements then, presented with concise and accurate slides. These are positive and qualified statements. The sentiment of the statement is positive and it's clear what concise and accurate means. If we move on then to the second set of feedback statements, the presentation was let down by a weak visual design. This, as you can probably tell from the red bar, is negative descriptive feedback. It's all very well telling someone that they've picked a weak visual design, but what does weak mean in this context? It's far better if this could be qualified and explained so that the learner knows what to do next time. These last two statements then about poor timekeeping and a flat delivery might initially appear to be simple, negative but qualified feedback, but they're actually negative and constructive. We don't have to spell out quite so explicitly every time what it means to improve a particular activity. For example, when we say that something's shown poor timekeeping, it's quite clear how that can be improved by having better timekeeping. A flat delivery, more or less the same. It's clear that to inject a bit more energy would be a way of addressing this piece of negative feedback. However, as we talked about before, it's better still to strive for positive constructive feedback. So let's reconsider this whole feedback set of statements in light of that desire to be positive and constructive. What we might say instead is that the presentation was a good topic choice. The good topic choice aligned with the course syllabus, presented with concise and accurate slides. We've now changed these negative constructive statements into positive constructive statements. Practicing a talk can help you keep to time and inject some energy into your delivery, and then give the learner some links to references for the design of slides. The same statements, but rephrased in a positive and constructive way. Now, like I said, there's no hard and fast rule for what makes good feedback. It may be that there are times when you feel it necessary to be a bit more explicit and perhaps a bit more negative to make sure that the learner has truly got the message. There are some additional things that we can do to make a feedback useful and constructive. I'm going to run through some of them synthesized from the literature and the references below, and I'll give you links to the references when we get to the end. It's important that feedback is professional. It's not personal, it's not focused on any personal characteristics of the learner. For example, if you were giving me feedback on this video, it'd be good if you could focus on the content of the video, what it means to give good feedback, and not focus on the fact that it's 7.5 months into lockdown and I really need a Corona haircut. It's also important to avoid rhetoric. Try taking some of the emotion out of the feedback, particularly where you need to be critical. It's important that feedback is clear and specific so that it can be easily digested. And it's very important that feedback is relevant. And there's a lot to this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining it. It needs to be relevant to the task in hand. You need to give learners feedback on what it is that you've asked them to do. The feedback needs to be aligned to the learning outcome and also to the assessment itself. There's some additional evidence about what makes good feedback and what makes relevant feedback. And that comes in particular from the Valerie Shute reference that I'll talk a bit more about at the end. What she talks about in her very lengthy review of the evidence base for giving feedback in higher education is that high achievers often need a specific type of feedback. They work best with feedback that is verifying, that asks them to try something again, and that is delayed. If you've got a learner that's doing really well, it's far better to let them carry on doing really well and maybe give them just a nudge, ask them to try something again and see how they get on, rather than necessarily being corrective and prescriptive. However, if you've got a learner that's struggling, what Valerie Shute calls a low-achieving learner, then it is perhaps better to be corrective and to give feedback immediately. If a student's really struggling, then they need to get back on track as quickly as possible, and this sort of feedback is the best way of getting them to do that. It's also important that feedback is constructive and deep. We've covered that in the previous slides, and as part of that, it needs to be actionable. When reading the feedback that you're giving to people, think about what it is that you're asking the learner to do with the feedback that you've given to them. Is there something that they can take away from this and turn into an action? The final point is that good feedback is concise. And if you're one of my students watching this and you're thinking, that's one thing Prof. Newton is not with his feedback is concise, I apologize. We can't all get it all right all of the time, but I'll try and bear it in mind for next time. All right, so what can we do? What are some steps that we can take to get these good principles of evidence-based feedback and put them into action, and also to help other people put them into action? I'm going to talk finally now about some studies we've done, some research we've done, looking at different ways of giving and collecting feedback. A simple summary of these is that it helps if you use structured questions. Don't give people a blank piece of paper and ask them to write feedback. Ask them specific questions. The one that we've had the most success with is a set of questions that's called Stop, Start, Continue. Now, this has a long history in feedback and in other circles. We did a study on it in 2015 where we compared the sorts of feedback that were given to people. In our case, this was feedback that we collected from learners. We asked them to give us feedback, and we compared the feedback that they gave us on a blank piece of paper versus feedback that they gave us when we asked them what we should stop doing, what we should start doing, and what we should continue doing. The feedback that we got when we used the Stop, Start, Continue method was far better than the feedback that we got when we used a blank piece of paper. And we analysed it using the descriptions that I used earlier on. The feedback that we got with Stop, Start, Continue was more qualified and more constructive, and there was less of the descriptive feedback. We got a similar result when we used we did a study looking at the feedback that we gave to students on particular assignments. Again, we compared feedback given with a blank piece of paper to a structured pro forma. In this case, the pro forma was structured as follows. There was a marking rubric or some marking classifications that set out the domains that were expected of students in order to get a good mark. We broke the feedback pro forma down so that for every one of those domains, every one of the things that students were expected to do, we asked the marker to write what worked, what could be improved, and referred them continuously back to the marking scheme. Again, we then analysed the feedback that was produced using the classification scheme I talked about earlier on, and we found that the feedback was deeper, it was more qualified, it was more constructive. Okay, a simple summary then of the principles of good evidence-based feedback that we've talked about in this video. The most useful one I can give you is that whenever you're writing feedback and whenever you're giving other people advice about how to give feedback, be that your learners or other markers or other academic colleagues, is to keep one simple principle in mind, and that is write the feedback as if you're giving the learner advice about what to do next time. In particular, giving them useful advice. If you keep that in mind, what do I want this person to do the next time they were to do this activity? You're well on the way. You can facilitate that by building in specific questions. Give the markers a feedback pro forma that asks specific questions. Ask them to target specific areas of an assignment. If you're collecting feedback from learners, don't just ask them for feedback, ask them for specific feedback on the areas that you want feedback on. The final point that we haven't really covered in great detail, but which is also very important, is to give both your learners and your markers training about what makes good feedback. This is particularly important, I think, in the modern age of higher education, where feedback is collected from learners all the time, but very little training is given to them about what makes useful feedback. We train our academic staff all the time. We give them lots of links to useful resources about feedback. Give those same resources or those same videos, this video even, to your students and say to them, look, if you're going to give us feedback, help make it useful for us so that you get the best feedback that you need next time. Okay, that's it. If you've got any questions, here's our email address, and I'll conclude with a short slide, which I'll leave on for a couple of seconds, that has some of the references and our contact details. Follow us on Twitter at MScMedEd. There's our email address, and these are the 4 references that I've used in the video. Hope to see you in another one. Bye-bye.